All good. All right. Well, welcome everyone. I hope you're all having a wonderful afternoon today. Welcome to the last session of the Philippines in Focus seminar series for the year, organized by the Philippines Australia Forum at La Trobe. And so today we'll be exploring the topic surrounding contingent breadwinners, precarious livelihoods of left behind family members of Filipino victims of trafficking. And I would also like to introduce our guest speaker for today, Associate Professor Dr. Sallie Ye. Now, Dr. Ye is the 2021 Tracey Banivanua Mar Fellow based in the Department of Social Inquiry at the Aubrey Wodonga campus at La Trobe University. And so she has research interests which span human trafficking, vulnerable migrations, and transnationalism. And she has published widely on these subjects in journals that include the Geo Forum, Gender, Place, and Culture, Work, Employment, and Society, and Environment and Planning, and Political Geography. Her current research projects examine issues around geographies of transnational justice and return migration for transient migrant workers and victims of trafficking. Her second monograph, titled Paved with Good Intentions, Human Trafficking and the Anti-Trafficking Movement in Singapore, was published with the Palgrave Macmillan in 2019. So welcome, Sallie, and thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you, Ray. Thanks for that kind introduction. First of all, I'd just like to start by making an acknowledgement to country. The land upon which I live and work and write and present is Wiradjuri country, and so I'd like to acknowledge their ongoing connection to the land and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'd also, yes.
Oh, sorry. Before you start, as we go on with our session, we will also have a Q&A section towards the end of our seminar. So for you, the audience, please feel free to use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screens and type in your questions as we're going along. And also feel free to use the chat function. So continue on, Sallie.
Okay, thanks, Ray. So I would also like to thank La Trobe Asia for supporting this really great idea of a seminar series, Philippines in Focus, and I hope that those seminars can continue next year. So thank you to Ray. Thank you also to Diana for helping to organise and make these seminars possible and a seamless experience. Now, I'd also like to, before I actually begin the presentation, to thank the collaborators, my Philippine collaborators for this project. In particular, I wanted to thank Ari Regino, who is my project coordinator based in Manila, for his excellent research assistance work, which has been particularly important during COVID. I'd also like to thank Arvin Peralta, who is the kind of go-to person for the International Transport Federation Union based in Manila, for his kind introduction to many of the participants in this current study, and also to Father Paolo Prigol from Stella Maris in Manila, who has also been really instrumental in supporting this project. And finally, Attorney Dennis Gorecho, who is also involved as a collaborator in this project and provides pro bono legal support to victims of labour exploitation and forced labour in fisheries. And the project that I'm speaking to today has been funded by La Trobe University from my Tracey Banivanua Mar Fellowship funds. So thanks also to La Trobe for providing financial support for me to be able to undertake this study. Now, I'll turn now to the actual presentation. And let's see, let's have a slideshow. Okay, I'm presuming everyone can see that Okay, that's good. All right, so the talk today is research in progress. It's not been completed yet. The first phase was done a few years ago, pre-COVID, and the second phase is currently underway. And the title of the talk, as Ari said, is Contingent Breadwinners, Precarious Livelihoods of Left Behind Family Members of Filipino Victims of Trafficking. And of course, the victims of trafficking that we are talking about in this study are victims of trafficking in the long-haul fishing industry or fishing crew. So the talk today will follow the following outline, and hopefully I'd actually like to get through it in half an hour so that we have a little bit more time for questions and discussions, because it is, you know, ideas that are developing. I would really like some feedback and, you know, just perhaps some insights that maybe I've missed, to have a broader conversation about the ideas that I'm developing through this research. So I will start by drawing out some of the conceptual and theoretical links from this study, and particularly I'm situating the study in literature on transnational householding and gender dynamics in transnational householding of, you know, migrant sending families, and also in the literature on migrant worker precarity. So I'll talk about that briefly, and then after that, give you a very quick overview of the study that I'm undertaking at the moment in the Philippines on this issue of seafood slavery. And then the main part of the presentation talks about the experiences of left behind women as what I call contingent breadwinners. So that's the term that I came up with to describe their experiences. And briefly then just some conclusions and reflections. So if we start by just looking at the literature that I'm situating this study in, as I said, there's a couple of areas that this project kind of intersects with. One is the literature on transnational householding and migrant worker families and familial relationships across borders. So this literature in the social sciences is really quite extensive. There's a lot of work looking at the way that families are reconfigured in the context of one family member migrating abroad for work. And so, you know, it's an interesting literature, but it makes some really, I think, overarching assumptions that I think are open to question when we talk about migrant workers who, for whatever reason, fail in their migration aspirations and goals. So, you know, the literature assumes, for example, that we have a single migrant breadwinner. So the family makes a decision, and it's either a male or a female family member who goes overseas, works and remits. That's a standard assumption in the literature. And so those left behind are considered the left behind family of that single migrant breadwinner. The literature also assumes nuclear families, that there is a male head of the household, wife or partner, and possibly extended family and children or other dependents. And I think the thing that I take exception with most in this literature is that assumes that migration will be successful. And when we talk about success, primarily here I'm talking about remittance practices, that migrants will be in a position to remit regularly, and that those remittances will bolster the left behind family and the household. So based on those assumptions, assumptions. This literature on transnational householding argues that there are negotiations over gender and gender roles, particularly if it's the woman who migrates for work. Men maybe have to take on domestic roles that can sometimes produce conflict and tension in the household. So that's one thing that this literature has looked at quite a lot. And related to that, shifting positions in the household or changing household dynamics in the context of having a migrant worker abroad. So, I just find this literature really, in many ways, really actually very frustrating, because it really downplays or almost completely ignores questions of migrant worker precarity and exploitation in the experiences of labour migration. So, of course, this then is very relevant, these questions of exploitation, to my research with men who migrate as fishing crew and become subject to forced labour or human trafficking. So then that points us in the direction of another body of literature in the social sciences on precarity in migrant households in Asia. And so it's here that I find some clues to help conceptualize and illuminate my empirical work in the Philippines. So we do have a literature now that talks about migrant worker precarity in the Asian region, and based on a broader literature that suggests that migrant workers may be considered a hyper precarious group, because not only are they subject to flexible labour conditions in the labour market, but because of migration issues, contract issues and so on, they have limited rights in the migration destinations. So their precarity is compounded precisely because they are migrant workers. So that is referred to as hyper precarity. There is a couple of really great articles or directions in this work on precarity and migrant workers. And this work looks back at what the implications are for human trafficking or forced labour for left behind households. So Nathan Green from NUS in Singapore, his work is really quite instrumental in this. And he talks about the translocal dimensions of migrant worker precarity, which he describes as the fragility of social reproduction strategies that migrant households employ across space. So in other words, when a migrant worker experiences precarity in their migration, how does that then produce precarity, or what implications does that have for these left behind households? And that's exactly the question that I wanted to ask in my research on left behind family members in the Philippines. So his work has been primarily in Cambodia. And then alongside this work on precarity in migrant households, we have these really interesting characterizations emerging in the geography literature on what are called destitution economies. And I find this really, really interesting. So destitution economies are basically economies that emerge that really take advantage of the poverty and the vulnerability that migrants find themselves in destination countries or in transit sites. So in other words, this literature is starting to look at the way that exploitation and precarity produce and reproduce precarity, and that they are central to, labour markets in transnational migration destinations. So I think that's really important for this discussion as well. So these are the ideas in the literature that have been informing my thinking about my empirical work. So the study then, the broader study on which this presentation is based examines the dimensions of forced labour of migrant fishers, primarily from Cambodia and the Philippines. And I have a particular focus on return from forced labour situations and a focus on family and household precarity. So it's that second part of the study that I'm talking about today. So the first phase of the fieldwork, as I said, was completed before COVID, and that involved interviews with 25 returned fishers, 18 in the Philippines, sorry, there's actually more there, more than I've got. No, that number's wrong. So there was 18 in the Philippines, and they came mainly from Luzon and the Visayas region in the Philippines. And then also 22 Cambodian return trafficked fishers who lived mainly in squatter areas out on the outskirts of Phnom Penh. And that first phase of fieldwork also involved interviews with family members, 3 in the Philippines and 13 in Cambodia. And as well as that, I conducted a household survey of 40 households in one high-sending migrant worker province in Cambodia, and that was mainly sending to Thailand. So the research was delayed, inevitably, as many people's research is because of COVID. The second phase of interviews I only really began this year in the Philippines, and so far 5 fishers have been interviewed and 3 wives or 3 left behind family members, and further interviews are planned for early 2023, hopefully. So let's turn now to the empirical material. I thought that I would just introduce the stories of 3 of the women that I've interviewed. And the first one is from the original or the first phase of the field work. So this woman, Maria, who in the picture is in the blue shirt, and she lives in Batangas, in a rural area, a farming area. And her husband was trafficked on a Taiwanese fishing vessel. I met her husband in Singapore when he sought assistance as a national in distress from the Philippine embassy there. So I interviewed the husband in Singapore, and then with their permission was able to follow up with them on a trip to the Philippines to look at the situation of the families in the absence of the husband. So Maria said that it was very difficult for her to survive when her husband was away, because in a very typical kind of situation, the men do not remit anything. So here we have again this, this breakdown of this key premise in the literature on migrant householding, that it's all based on remittance sending and successful migration stints. So for her husband, he was on board the vessel for 14 months and didn't go to shore, so there was no contact with the family. And she never received any remittance during that time. And she actually didn't know what had happened to him. And of course, he did not know that she was not receiving remittances either, because he had no way of communicating with her. So you can imagine what kind of situation or position that put her in. She really didn't know what was going on. So in his absence, she had to find a way to survive. And she has kids. So this is a quote from her interview. "When my husband was away, no money, salary remittance, ever came from the agency. I have 2 children to feed and school, and I was not working because we planned to rely on my husband's income. I live in my husband's village and my own family is far away in another province, so they cannot help me with anything. I'm too embarrassed to ask them for money. So I started cultivating some of the land, and we just ate most of our food from that. With the extra produce I sold at market, I bought rice and some essential things needed for the children. Every day I would walk down to their school and bring them lunch that I made, because I couldn't afford to pay for their lunches." So in her experience, there were no opportunities for paid work where she lived, because she was in a rural area. She had limited formal education. And so the only alternative for her was to start to subsistence farm and then supplement the family income through trying to sell some of that produce at market. So that's one particular strategy that is very common to women who are left behind. And I also found the same thing with some of the Cambodian women when their husbands were abroad and not remitting. Now, the next 2 case studies or women that I draw on here are from the more recent or the current phase of the field work. And these 2 women, both, so I've given their full names here, they've both been cited in the media. Their stories have appeared in the Philippine media. And the reason for that is because they were trying to pressure the manning agency that recruited their husbands to pay them the owed salary. So they decided to come out and tell their stories in the media. So I interviewed them separately from the media stories, but this here is a quote from one of the media stories that came out about Angelica. So it goes, "She is desperate. She is alone with her 2 young children while her partner is at sea on a Chinese fishing vessel. He's been away for 4 months. In all that time, his family has not seen him, nor a single peso of his pay, a portion of which is supposed to be sent to them by Angelica's partner's manning agent. We have 2 kids who need milk and diapers and other basic items," she told the ITF. "But we have not received an allotment, and it's 4 months since he joined the vessel. I need money for my 10-month-old baby and my 3-year-old boy." So that was the reporting of her story in the media in the Philippines. So the question then is, well, how did she survive? So to flesh out some of the details of her experience, she's actually a college graduate. She's received her bachelor's in hotel and resort management. And she was working as a regular employee in the operations department of a supermarket in Manila. But even though interestingly, even though she in the family was the regular income earner and actually the main income earner before her husband joined the fishing vessel, she and her husband both considered him to be the main breadwinner. Now, Her 2 children were being raised by her parents back in Mindoro, which is in Luzon. And she and her partner rented a small room in Manila where they both worked. So they were internal labour migrants, and they remitted salary back to her parents to help support the children and the parents. Now, her husband didn't remit any money for the 8 months that he was on board the fishing vessel. She continued to work in Manila, and she said that she only ate instant noodles and eggs the entire time because she had to cut costs. Eventually, she had to borrow money from relatives. Thankfully, there was no interest on those loans. She also took out a low-interest loan from her employer in Manila to the value of 40,000 pesos, which is about $680. She also pawned some of her jewelry given to her by her sister. Her husband was promised a salary of $450 a month, from which she was supposed to receive a regular allotment of $150 per month. She also had no contact with her husband for the entire period he was on the vessel, so she couldn't explain to him that she had not received any remittances or any allotment from the agency. So, her method of surviving then was to reduce her eating and to take out loans and to continue working in Manila, even though the plan was for her to go back to Mindoro while her husband was on the fishing vessel, because he was taking over the role as the main breadwinner. So she actually hasn't paid back the 40,000 peso loan to her employer yet. And the other experience, the other interview from this year is another woman who was actually, her husband was recruited by the same manning agency as Angelica's husband. So again, there was some media reportage around her experience, and it reads, in September, that is last year, the ITF published details about the case of Leslie Ann de Torres, the wife of a seafarer who had been unable to contact her husband for more than 8 months by that time, and feared for his welfare. So thanks to the ITF, her husband has been revealed to be alive and still working on board a Chinese flagged fishing vessel. De Torres is now expected home later this month after the ship owner, rather than the manning agency, insisted that he return. So, same situation then. In her case, she said that her husband's original contract, like Angelica's husband, was $450 a month, but the contract was substituted immediately prior to his departure from the Philippines. And his new salary was reduced to $310 a month. And he was forced to sign an agreement that stated that his wife would only receive an allotment of $150 a month. So essentially, it's gone from $450 to $150 a month. And of course, at this time, Leslie was completely unaware of this change in the contract substitution, because she had already lost contact with her husband. And so $150, well, even if it's $310 a month, where is the rest of that salary going? $50 is given to the fishermen as an allowance on the vessel, and the rest of the salary is put away by the manning agency as a form of forced savings. And this has been going on actually for years. I documented this almost 10 years ago with Filipino fishermen. that the manning agencies ask the fishers to sign agreements and substituted contracts. And the agreements state that they will agree to forced savings. And if they break their contract, they forfeit that forced savings. So in essence, it's a form of debt bondage. So anyway, for Leslie, she was entirely unaware of this. So she had been expecting a much larger remittance from her husband. Now, the vessel her husband was deployed on was supposed to dock after 6 months, so she could then communicate with him. But it failed to dock, so she had no way of understanding his situation. And in fact, she had no communication with him for over a year. When her husband left, she was a full-time homemaker, with extra income earned as a grade school tutor after he left. But that really only amounted to 1,000 pesos or so a month, not enough to support the family by any means. She lives with her parents, plus her son. So in essence, she has 3 dependents to support in the absence of her husband sending remittances. She started to incur debts of between 3,000 and 5,000 Philippine pesos, and at least 20,000 pesos of the debts that she accrued remain unpaid at this time. And the only way to pay this debt is for her husband to take another job abroad. So that in itself throws up some interesting questions about repatriation and reintegration and re-trafficking, which is the subject of another paper, I guess. So those are just some of the experiences of the women that I've interviewed. And I'll finish up in a minute so we can have a bit more of a discussion about this. So I want to tease out from these women's experiences this concept of contingent breadwinners. And so this idea I had comes from the literature on contingent work. And contingent work is essentially employment arrangements where the worker has a non-traditional relationship with the employer, characterized by flexibility, precarity, lack of protection, low, irregular pay or remuneration for work performed. The rhythms of work are unpredictable, they're relational and responsive, and they're often frenetic and urgent. And they're gendered. So a lot of the literature on precarious or contingent work pits women as constituting or being subject to the highest risk of engaging in contingent or precarious work, particularly in labour migration. And contingent work also talks, the literature also talks about the cultural and the moral ethos of the erosion of personhood. So in other words, that the personal or familial responsibility becomes the norm. And of course, we can understand that in the face of the rollback of social protections, particularly in an era of neoliberal capitalist globalization. So, you know, this era that we're living is shaping all these aspects of contingent work. So what I want to say then is that contingent work of these migrant fishers is a relational construct that produces contingent work within the household. And so, you know, the left behind family members or the left behind wives in this case also become contingent workers, not just the men who are being exploited on these fishing vessels. And the reason I have not chosen to call this contingent workers or contingent left behind workers is because I also want to tease out the fact that the strategies are not just about paid work or working for an employer. But they're also about using any means necessary to substitute for the absence of the male breadwinner. So, you think about Maria and her subsistence farming, and you think about Angelica and Leslie and the borrowing of money, the loans that they have taken out. And in Leslie's case, the pawning of assets. And in Angelica's case, also, the possible health implications for her of reducing her food intake or compromising her food intake to save money. So it's not just about finding work to make up for the lost remittances. It's about a range of different strategies that come together to kind of compensate for that lack of breadwinning role. So the conclusions then, or not really conclusions because it's ongoing work, I think the study extends some of the ways that we think about the literature on transnational householding. The first one is introducing the complexities that precarity and failure present to transnational household dynamics. And so, there's a lot more that could be done here in the Philippines, and also there's some really good work, as I said, on this for the Cambodian context. I think we can also extend discussions of the way gender roles are reconfigured, not just as a result of successful migrations, but also through failed migration stints. So these women essentially become de facto breadwinners for their family. And then, of course, as I've said, introducing this concept of the contingent breadwinner to help frame some of these alternative dynamics. And so maybe some questions that we can possibly throw up for future research in this area. And of course, I would hazard a guess that there are similar situations in many other Asian contexts, including Cambodia, Bangladesh, and Indonesia, but of course not limited to those countries. And some of the questions that could guide future research in this field might include how are characterizations of destitution economies, how can they be furthered or further elaborated by drawing on the insights from the study of contingent breadwinners and failed migrant workers? And can contingent breadwinners achieve analytical purchase in examining the situations of precarious migrants and their families in other contexts beyond the Philippines? Well, I think already we've started to establish that is certainly the case in Cambodia. And how are other livelihood strategies, such as selling of assets or reducing food intake, folded into expressions of contingent breadwinning? And through what kind of research modalities can participants elaborate their situations and advocate for recognition of hyper precarious gendered norms and gendered strategies? So that's it for the presentation. I hope I didn't whiz through it too quickly, just in the interest of having some discussion and questions, and there's references there as well. So I guess you can contact myself or Ray or Diana if you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. There's no paper on it yet. It's in progress, but hopefully at some point early to mid next year, there'll be a publication coming out based on this work.
Wonderful.
So that's it.
Well, thank you so much for sharing, Sallie. That was, to me at least, very insightful, and hope for everybody else. And, I think this is definitely a really big issue, not just in the Philippines, but all over in the Southeast Asia region. Especially my first experience and insight to your work was writing a story about your previous research about the exploitation of men on the offshore fishing vessels. But I see that we have questions from our audience. We have two questions here. So the first question is from Christian Wells, asking, were any Filipino migrant workers affected by the recent spate of Chinese call/cyber scam centers in Cambodia, largely based around Sinakuville, that are involved in human trafficking, false imprisonment, and forced labor? And is this form of human trafficking likely to become more common in the Southeast Asia region?
That's probably not a question that's related primarily to this talk. So I wouldn't like to actually give an answer to that one because it's not something that I'm doing research on, unfortunately. So I think, it would just be an anecdotal answer. So my apologies that I won't be able to answer that question in any detail. Perhaps some of the other participants would know more than me about that.
That's totally all right, but that is a good question to raise up, and because it kind of dabbles into the human trafficking aspect of things as well. So with that, we'll move on to the second question by Lisa Denny. I'd be interested to know to what extent indebtedness that women might enter into the cope while partner is migrating for work then encourages remigration within the household as a strategy to get out of indebtedness? Or do returnists tend not to remigrate given their initial experiences?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and that's something that I am looking at in this study. And unfortunately, quite sadly, most of the women that I interviewed and their partners and other returned fishermen, some of them had already remigrated, mostly to work on fishing vessels. And indebtedness was one of the key drivers of that out-migration, return migration. And in discussions with the ITF in the Philippines and also Stella Maris in the Philippines, they see this as a very important and neglected issue. The return and reintegration program for trafficked fishermen is really inadequate to build the kind of financial resilience in these households to stop them engaging in future very precarious out-migration stints. So absolutely, this is incredibly common, and it's something that I'm building or trying to build a database on now. And in fact, it did affect the fieldwork for this second phase of the study, because when we tried to contact some of the fishers, they'd already gone. They had already left to go back on fishing vessels, even after having these really horrendous experiences. And the same thing I did find with the Cambodian fishers that I interviewed a few years ago. Many of them, the majority of them, had remigrated to Thailand, either to work on fishing vessels or some other form of, low-skilled or low-valued employment.
All right. Well, thank you for that answer, Sallie. I also would like to introduce you to the Philippine Consulate General, Maria Lourdes Salcedo, who would like to give some of her comments about your presentation. Welcome, Maria.
Thanks, Ray. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Sallie, for your study. I don't know how to put this, but I do have a great interest on trafficking and migration since I became the principal assistant of the Undersecretary for Migrant Workers back in 1998 in the DFA. So I did join the group which looked into situations of trafficking in the lead up to the passing of the bill of the legislation in the Philippines. But the stories you shared this afternoon, they're not out of the ordinary. You know, it's like almost a norm. Whether the husbands or the male partners become traffic and enter into a destitution way of livelihood, the women have always been contingent breadwinners. So I think the story more is like how resilient are women running their families in spite of what happens to the family. But you know, listening to you saying that we should reform the way, or we should warn our workers not to get into this kind of livelihood. It's easier said than done, because you know we have a saying in Filipino that kapit sa patalim. It's like if you don't have anything to put on the table for your family to eat, you know, you hang on to the knife, you know, literally. You hang on to the blade. So that's how it is with this kind of situation. So listening to your study, it's more like how would I put it? It's more like it's very condescending. Sorry to say this one, but it sounds to me as very condescending. It's easier to say that you know, the Philippines and Cambodia, we have a big part of our population under poverty. But I think the research should look into how to resolve this. How can we reform these owners of fishing vessels not to practice slave-like conditions in their business? You know, because they are the ones who have the means to, because they have the capital and they have the power, economic power in their hands. And you know, these poor people who want to earn for their family become well, you can say willing victims often, because kapit sa patalim, they would like to give food for their family. So I think research should be more geared towards addressing how businesses could reform themselves, how businesses could be more ethical in hiring these people and not you know, victimizing these poor people in especially from the regional areas. So I think I would stop there, and I hope you can tweak your research a bit, or maybe expand it sometime and look at how we can reform and how we can get the businesses be more ethical in their ways. Thank you.
Could I respond to that, Ray?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that comment. And in fact, that is definitely part of this research. So I was in Manila a couple of weeks ago and did some key informant interviews with several people who are involved in supporting returned trafficked fishermen. And I think, so there are two types of businesses that are really benefiting from the exploitation of these Filipino men's labor. One are the foreign fishing companies, the fleets, which are usually Taiwanese or Chinese, sometimes South Korean, and the Filipino registered manning and recruitment agencies. So, you know, I was definitely looking at how these manning agencies could be held accountable to make sure that the fishermen that they deployed on these vessels were being protected, to make sure that their contracts were not being substituted, when in fact it's actually the Philippine manning agencies that were substituting the contracts. So there are I guess there are lots of different elements to the exploitation of these men, some that has to do with contract fraud and debt bondage, and others that have to do with labour exploitation and forced labour on the fishing vessels themselves, and violence and abuse of the fishers. So looking at how the manning agencies can be held accountable, how civil claims can be pursued by fishermen and their advocates to be able to get their salaries that have been owed to them. So restitution and compensation claims can be successfully pursued. I think those are really actually very important ways forward, because if they were able to get their owed salary, many of them, or who knows, but maybe a few of them at least, would not be pushed to or compelled to go abroad again through very constrained choices. So that's definitely something that I'm continuing to look at in the research as well.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much, Maria, for your feedback and comments as well, and Sallie for providing your insight on how you would like to proceed with your research following those comments. Following on or going on to the fishermen's salaries, we have a question from Fiona Russell in chat asking, are there any statistics on the number of fishers that actually receive the payment or their salaries that is put aside for them at the end of their contract?
Let me see. Sorry, can you read the question again? I can't
Sure.
see it there.
Are there any statistics on the number of fishers that actually receive their salaries that is put aside for them at the end of their contracts?
No, there's nothing like that. And in fact, I am working with the ITF and Stella Maris to establish a database, because they are the two organisations, at least in the Philippines, along with one other, that are really supporting the fishermen on their immediate return to the Philippines. So it's absolutely important. It's crucial that that kind of database with that information and other statistics be established, because without that knowledge, it's very difficult for us to have an evidence base to look at how policies might be changed or how NGOs might better support these fishermen. So there's nothing like that exists, unfortunately.
Yes, yeah, and I think that's a good point, in that having those statistics and data could help create like a blueprint, at least to look onto, and then see how organizations can provide support for these families. Now we have a question from Daryl asking, how would you regard the performance of the POEA with regard to the bad treatment of OFWs in various countries?
Well, it's difficult again. I don't really want to fob off questions, but it's actually quite difficult to answer that question at the moment, because the POEA is currently undergoing restructuring and being reformed in the Philippines. A new migrant worker ministry with various, that umbrella and various departments and components under that. So at the moment, it's very much in flux. And so when I was in the Philippines a couple of weeks ago, I actually didn't do any government interviews because these issues about responsibility and how mechanisms to ensure safe migration can be improved were very much still being worked out and very much under consideration. I mean, one of the great things that the Philippines does, which many other countries in the Asian region don't do or don't do very well, is the Philippines has often very, very proactive labour attaches and assistance to nationals attaches at its embassies. And these are really, really, in my experience, these actors are absolutely crucial in supporting overseas Filipino workers who've experienced exploitation in their migrations. So I guess, you know, everybody's kind of waiting to see how this new infrastructure of migration support will play out in the Philippines.
And hopefully,
may I add, Ray?
Sure thing.
Sallie? Yeah. Sallie was right that there's a new department for migrant workers, and POEA will come under that. The problem with POEA at the moment is it's proactively promoting overseas employment. At the same time, our migrant workers, they face a lot of problems. So we have the OWA, but we don't know yet how these two agencies will play out in the new Department of Migrant Workers Affairs. We do have a proactive, as mentioned by Sallie, assistance to nationals, and currently personnel from the Department of Foreign Affairs, like myself, right, we have a responsibility to look after those in distress, because we have a special law which criminalizes, diplomats like us who will not extend assistance to those in distress. So it's promotion and protection of the welfare of Filipino migrant workers is a pillar of Philippine foreign policy. So it's very important to us. Yes, thank you.
Thank you for that, Maria. And that's really encouraging to know that that is part of the foreign policy, meaning that there will be support for those that, who need it. We have 3 more questions. Let's see how we go with them with the time remaining. So from Leon Carlo Aquino asks, hello, I noticed that the case studies here revolve around sea-based occupations, which I notice creates an added level of precarity. Would you have any insight into how the situations might differ for migrant workers in land-based occupations?
Yeah, so I have done research with Filipino migrants who've migrated as entertainers and also as foreign domestic workers in Singapore and in South Korea. And so in those cases, interestingly, when we talk about the nuclear family kind of ideal, that perhaps in these cases, the female, the wife or the mother migrates, but the same pattern where there is exploitation or where there's trafficking. The same situation where the women are not in a position to remit. What I found that is distinct in the experiences of women and on these land-based sectors is that many of these female migrants came from single-headed families, or they were single mothers, for example. So the dynamics of what might happen with the left behind family can be quite different from the case of the fishermen. I mean, that's not always the case, but for many women, it was parents who were taking care of their children, and they were separated or they were single mothers. So that introduced a very different dynamic into these discussions about left behind families. And also, I mean, one thing that's common to the male migrants in the fishermen and also to female migrants in land-based sectors is the experience, the emotional experience of stigma and shame. So rather than there being differences, that was a commonality. And I've actually published something on that looks comparatively at fishermen and women in these other sectors and their experiences of shame and stigma through failed migration and how that plays out once they actually return home. I won't say any more to that just because I'm conscious of the time.
That's all right. And I would also like to suggest, Ian, if you want to get in touch with Sallie, please feel free to do so, and she'll be more than happy to send you that study. I suggest we'll go with one more question by Diana Savina Hatajulu. Hopefully I'm pronouncing your name all right. And the question is, are there any support from local community groups or provision from government programs that supports the economic empowerment of the women of contingent breadwinners?
Yeah, so that's also a really important question. So the organisations that I mentioned at the start that support migrant seafarers and migrant fishers do provide financial support to the left behind women and also to the fishermen. But I guess the issue there is that this support is often very short term, and the money is not a lot. It's just very small amounts, and it often just supports the actual return home. So once they reach the Philippines, returning transportation back to their home, and a small amount of money apart from that. So there's definitely a need for better supports, financial supports to assist with reintegration, successful reintegration. But of course, that is not just an issue that faces the Philippines. I mean, every country in this region faces the same challenges with successful reintegration and how to achieve it, and the financialization and the capacity to actually realize that is very difficult.
Indeed. I agree with that in terms of, really looking at the reintegration part from coming, reintegration into the land is really, a big part, and having support for that for the families and the migrant workers is definitely crucial. Let's go for one more last question. This is from an anonymous attendee. How common is it for the grandparents to be the primary caregivers of their grandchildren, while both parents are away working overseas or in urban centers in the Philippines? And is it more common in certain regions of the Philippines?
Yes, it is very common for both parents to migrate either internally or overseas for work. But it's only common where, the situation allows for that. In other words, where there are parents living close by who are willing to take on that caregiving role of the children. And often even where only one family member migrates, often the wife, it's still common for parents or grandmother, for example, to take on a very big caring role for grandchildren, even if the husband is still at home, because quite often he may work as well, or be unwilling to take on all of those domestic responsibilities. there's been some very interesting work on this issue in Cambodia, again, looking at the implications and the mental and physical health of children who are cared for by aging parents when both aging grandparents when both parents migrate abroad for work. And the conclusions of that research for Cambodia are really quite sad in a way. The children are often ostracized at school, withdrawn. Many of them, suffer from or are the subject of bullying. And so there are emotional and mental health aspects to this transnational householding that I think are definitely worth exploring in more detail, both in the Philippines and elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you, Sallie, for that. And I think that is a great pathway to, what you can work on for the future of your research. We just have, before we go, we just have one more comment from Berlin Guerrero. Hopefully I'm pronouncing your name correct. Hi, Sallie. I met you in Wodonga in 2014. I believe the emergence of contingency breadwinners in the Philippines is more of the result of, one, the need for international fishing companies for cheap labor, and two, the need for the sending country for dollar remittances to buy you up an economy in chronic crisis. This means the export of labor is a government/policy program, as highlighted by the creation of the Department of Foreign Employment.
Yes. Hi, Berlin. Yes, I remember from Albury Wodonga. Yeah, as Maria also said, that it's very difficult, particularly at the moment with the kind of post-COVID crisis that many economies are finding themselves in. There is this this dual policy of the need for remittances and the reliance on remittances, but on the other hand, the dilemma or the difficulty of counterbalancing that with the high risks of exploitation of migrant workers in certain sectors, and of course the fishing industry is one of those sectors. So, I guess hopefully the new Ministry of Migrant Workers will be able to better balance those two issues, but I don't know how they're going to do it, because it's definitely a very challenging task, I think, to address that.
Well, to end our seminar, I just want to thank you, Sallie, again for sharing your work with us, and thank you everyone for submitting your questions, very insightful questions, and also Maria for your insightful feedback on Sallie's work. I apologize we did go over time, but I believe our discussion was very worthwhile. So thank you again for the seminar. And just I want to remind you, everyone, that this webinar has been recorded. So if you have signed up using your email, you will receive the appropriate links when they are available. There is a video and audio recording that will be out soon. And also, please follow us on Twitter at @PathLatrobe and @Trobe Asia, or join our mailing list to find out more about our online activities and events. So once again, thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, Sallie. And I wish you all a great afternoon.
Thank you. Thanks, Ray. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.